Joe, you said something really interesting on Twitter last month, and as soon as you said it, I was like, dude, what is this? What does this mean? I want to know what this means. I'm going to read it. Oh, I should have been really slick and have it up in my mix here, but I don't. Modernity is the age of isolation. Isolation is the destruction of patterns. The destruction of patterns is the destruction of life itself. The mono-functional machine. Okay, Joe. Time to learn me up, dude. I want to get on your level. I want to know what that means.
Okay. Let's so this is really, I mean, this is a tweet that's essentially a distillation of complexity science, right? So what is complexity science all about? Well, complex systems are systems where there's a lot of pieces that interact in some way. And those interactions, this is the key to making a system, quote unquote, complex. Those interactions are non-trivial, meaning that if you looked at, say, piece A in isolation and you looked at piece B in isolation and you studied them for all of eternity and knew everything about A and B, you still wouldn't know or understand or be able to predict what happens when A and B start interacting. So the interaction is non-trivial. That's what that means. So the first piece to understand is that complex system science is all about the difference between the behavior of things when they're either in isolation or not. Now, almost everything in the real world is not in isolation. Isolation typically comes from an effort to isolate things from some kind of in an experiment. For instance, you might build a chamber. Imagine a physical experiment where you're building a chamber and you have a lot of insulation, right, to control, for instance, heat transferring through and changing the conditions. So in general, in the real world, things are not isolated, but all of the reductionist research and science that's been done for a few hundred years now, and it has come to be sort of the operating assumptions not only of scientists but of kind of mainstream culture and what I'd call the scientism that we subscribe to almost as a state religion. It doesn't understand that distinction I just described, that things in isolation behave differently than things when they're interacting. So maybe a more visceral example, imagine that this conversation that you and I are having. Imagine that instead of it being this conversation, I was just sitting in a room alone, talking how I'm talking and saying what I'm saying. Well, you'd say I was fucking nuts, right? So when we're together, we behave differently. We're greater than the sum of our parts. We're different than the sum of our parts. That's the main theme. So a lot of times this idea of isolation gets conflated with differentiation. So as an example, in your body, you have a heart and you have lungs, and they're both part of your cardiovascular system. They're clearly different. They're very much differentiated, but they're not in isolation. They interact in an important way. Now, if your heart went off to the office for work for the day while your lungs stayed home to watch the kids, that would change what your heart and your lungs do when you take them out of contact with one another. So that's basically what we've been doing in modernity is thinking we understand the function of something. Well, we understand the heart. We understand how that works. We understand the husband. We understand the wife. We can actually now isolate these variables and we'll gain efficiency that way. We'll optimize the system. They don't have to be in contact. They don't have to be together anymore. So now in the example of the heart and the lungs, you separate them. Well, they very quickly wither and die. So it's a very dramatic kind of lack of persistence. When it comes to, say, husband and wife, you can separate them and it seems like everything's fine. They're not just going to immediately perish, but you've changed something fundamental and it's going to have effects. They might take a while to show up. They might look subtle at first, but they will show up. So modernity has been this big project of doing that, thinking we understand the function of a thing and then trying to optimize around that function, isolate a thing as much as possible, and we lose these sort of persistent things that are persistently in the presence of one another and the patterns that arise out of that. So I said also that isolation is the destruction of patterns. Where do patterns come from in the real world? It's not like an artist who has a canvas and starts painting, a pattern and putting this piece there and that piece there until it's a pattern. there's no one, not to get theological. So some might construe God this way, but in a scientific sense, there is not a painter. Instead, there is all of us making our own individual decisions, taking our own individual actions, and together, out of all those local interactions, patterns emerge at a higher level that no one is sort of constructing or putting into place or directing. So it's the interactions that allow the patterns to exist. Now, when I say life itself is made out of patterns, that's sort of the other sort of the other fundamental piece to understand about complex systems, is that we're saying that interactions are important and non-trivial. Not only are interactions important and non-trivial, they are the stuff itself. It's not a sort of philosophy of substance first, like, oh, what's a person made of? Oh, they're atoms. Well, put that person in a blender, you still have the same pile of atoms, but the person's gone. So the thing is the pattern. And so life it has to do with the patterns that are being enacted by the stuff, so to speak. The stuff itself is almost, in some real sense, secondary to the patterns. So when we start to isolate things, we start to destroy those patterns. There's nothing but patterns, and so you're destroying the life. And the patterns that we generate on collective scales are often very illegible. That's a word that comes from James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, where he talks about this idea of legibility and illegibility. And basically, as we centralize states, they sought to be able to observe what's going on. To observe what's going on, they had to make things legible, write them down on tables and stuff like that. And in so doing, they had to destroy the patterns of the systems that they looked at, because those systems had a lot of stuff in them that they didn't know how to write down. They couldn't write down. And we've been on that trajectory in a massive way ever since the foundation of the modern state. So this is the general idea, is that we think because we don't see something in a direct way, or it's illegible for us, we don't quite understand what the patterns are, that it's like the patterns aren't even there or don't exist, when they're really, it's almost like we are naturally, we naturally as human beings form these kind of superorganisms where the community structure and the societal structure have all these important kinds of functional relationships to one another. The patterns they produce are such that the pattern can continue to persist in time, but we're destroying those. So how we persist as a collective is a big question without those patterns, and the answer might be we don't.
Tremendous amount of information there, Joe. My mind is going in a million different directions. One of the things I want to drill down on, what do you mean by modernity in particular here, and how does it create the isolation? But before you do that, I just want to relate how I see this working in my own life. So the liminal order is based on masculinity, brotherhood, and sovereignty. Okay. And we see those sort of building on each other. And there's characteristics of masculinity that make a masculine man. And then you get a bunch of masculine men together. They behave in a certain number of ways based on certain values that produces a brotherhood. And that brotherhood is conducive to producing sovereignty. Okay. And that is the sort of general philosophy of our values and organization that we have. And the way I'm hearing this is to say you can be a man, but you can't be a brother unless you've got the interactions. And the interactions among men are the brotherhood, are the thing, right? A man in isolation is of no use to society or to sovereignty, but together, those interactions together, the patterns that emerge from people being together with these types of values and parameters, which we'll get to a little bit later, of behavior, they produce an outcome that is separate from the individual items. And without them being together and interacting, then the output doesn't occur. And for me, modernity, I've talked to Alexander Dugan. He's got a definition of modernity. Everybody's got a definition of modernity. But in this case, for me, I'm going to use it to mean sort of the anti-masculine, anti-feminine push from radical feminism and CRT and the whole thing, I think whether intuitively or specifically they understood that if you destroy the component parts, then the interactions don't occur, and if the interactions don't occur, then this thing that they're after doesn't occur as well. But also you can then, even if the component parts still exist or persist, then if you destroy the interactions, the brotherhood of masculine men, then whatever their outcomes were that happened to take place by being together and interacting in certain circumstances, then that outcome doesn't happen either. And I think that we experiencing that as a nation, and that's my interpretation of a very personal reflection of what you're talking about. So am I a nut on that? And then maybe go back and let's drill down on modernity and how does it create this isolation you're talking about?
So I love this example of a brother and then a brotherhood. So a brother is exactly, what is a brother? It's a relational definition. So we can talk about relational properties in complex systems. And so a brother is a man, as you say, that has certain kinds of relationships, certain kind of interactions. So in the same way that the function of the heart is to pump blood, not to itself, ultimately yes to itself, but it needs to pump blood to the rest of the body. And so the when we say the function of the heart is to pump blood to the rest of the body, we have to look outside of the heart itself, its interactions. And so the man, if his function is to participate in the brotherhood, well, he's got to be in this context. It's actually a property that looks like it's a property of the man, but it's really a property of the system that's showing itself in the man. So I love that as an example. Let me just jump into the modernity stuff, or at least my working definition of it. I don't have a kind of broad political, socio-political definition. It's really about the process by which the artifacts of the world are generated, and it's this turn from bottom-up dynamics to top-down dynamics. And I alluded to some of that earlier when we were talking, when I was saying that we kind of looked, now we understand the function of the man is to make money and go and support the family that way. So he can go to the office 40 hours a week, and he can commute, 20 hours a week or whatever it is. And so it's this idea that top-down design of patterns are always going to be insufficient when it comes to like ecosystems, very complex systems that have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of subtle functional interactions. The destruction of those kinds of relations and interactions in favor of what is believed to be what the model is, what the design says, what the blueprints instruct, that is modernity. So when you talk about particular instances like certain brands of feminism or certain attempts to teach certain things or destroy certain kinds of behaviors under the guise of toxic masculinity, these are all instances of this very much larger pattern of, I have the idea of how things should be, and I'm going to go mold the world into this idea. Well, one of the things I like to say that gets people riled up sometimes on Twitter, and I kind of repeat it because it gets people riled up, which I didn't anticipate when I first said it. It's kind of amusing to me, is that imagination is overrated. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that. Imagination is overrated. Why? Because you could imagine the most great thing, this, that, the other thing, and now I'm going to make the world conform to my beautiful imagination. And guess what? You always do more harm than good. You always fuck things up. Your imagination is nothing compared to the dimensionality and the complexity of reality. And the only way to get a reality that functions in a healthy way, doesn't just kind of limp along, sick and tired and maybe going to die, but a functional, healthy system, is to work with the bottom-up dynamics of the system, which you'll never understand fully. No single person, institution, model will ever capture it fully. It's impossible. So we have to develop some other way of relating to the world than this sort of modern, scientific, top-down, design-heavy, blueprint-heavy type of approach to thinking about the world. Models are really just models, and it's a cliche to say the map is not the territory, but it should be even more cliche because people haven't gotten it yet.